I hope everybody had a chance to complete last week's readings and are well into this week's readings and are proceeding well with them. I also understand that for the first couple of weeks we're covering a wide variety of materials in a long historical period fairly quickly. We're really going from 1900 right down to 1945 in the space of about 2 weeks. But in this lecture I do want to summarize a little bit of what I dealt with in the first week and that were there in the readings, and what some of the key points of those readings were. One of the first key takeaways from the introduction in the best text, the 20th century world text, is the key point that the authors of the text want to make about what they take to be the motive forces of the 20th century and 20th century international history. And by motive forces, I mean those broader impulses or developments that were driving along the historical process in the 20th century. The first, identified by Best and his colleagues, is globalization. And by globalization, I mean the process by which far-flung places in the globe were becoming united by technology, by trade, by the exchange of peoples as much as the exchange of goods. This was a process, as this map indicates, that was already well underway by the end of the 19th century, but that absolutely continues down into our present day. Indeed, many of you noted in your contributions to the introductory discussion last week that one of the things that define you is the places, often quite far distant from British Columbia, from which you come. This is a form of globalization in action. The second impulse was that toward modernization, or, as the authors suggest, the perfection of modernity. And these are really two different things. In its broadest form, we ought to understand modernization as a process in which there is a transition from low technology subsistence economies, i.e. economies that used human-powered implements for production, and where the object of production was the use value of whatever was produced, be it food or clothing, rather than its market value. It was a transition from that kind of low-technology subsistence economy to industrial capitalist economies, where ever more complex and powerful machines were key to the productive process, and where profit, not the use of whatever was being produced, was the object of production. This transition is the process of modernization. At times it was a process that seemed to grow naturally, as if industrialization and capitalism were somehow inherent impulses of world history. But while industrial capitalism has certainly proved to be a system of immense productive capacity that far outstrips any other kind of productive system humans have ever produced, it was hardly simply an accident or an inherent part of history. Ultimately, as we will see, the functioning of industrial capitalist economies required the development of complex systems of law and political power that guaranteed that the machine power, the human power, the raw materials, and the markets necessary to the success of capitalism would be available. And that was not an accident. But it was not simply modernization itself that helped shape the 20th century. It was also that modern economic systems promised modern political systems, i.e. ones that were democratic and celebrated the rights of the individual and had constitutions and the equal rule of law. And they also promised increasing social equality, where the wealth of the system would be shared more evenly amongst all its inhabitants. Yet throughout much of the 20th century, we have seen that wealth and freedom have been unequally distributed, despite the advance of modern capitalist economies. This was true of capitalist societies themselves, where wealth was often controlled and accumulated by a narrow few at the top of society. But it was equally true of humanity as a whole, where wealth and freedom were disproportionately enjoyed by those who lived in the global north in places like Europe, as opposed to those who lived in the global south, places like India or Africa or China. It was the rule of the developed world as opposed to that of the underdeveloped or less developed world. It was the first world that profited and enjoyed freedom and wealth rather than the third world, to use a phrase that was only invented in 1950. A third trend identified by the authors was the general tendency over the 20th century of the diffusion of power away from Europe. There is a key and implicit point here, which is to say that up until the end of the 19th century, Europe was in fact the center of global power. And I will have more to say about why that was and how it manifested itself later in this week's lectures. But suffice it to say for now that the state of affairs began to come to an end with World War I and World War II. Indeed, in the 30 or so years from 1914 to 1945, many of the global empires of Europe were demolished, and those that remained were very much subordinated to the whims of so-called new superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union. Equally important in the shift of power away from Europe was the rise to national independence, and sometimes substantial world power, of formerly colonized places like India and China and much of sub-Saharan Africa. But here is a third trend, that diffusion of power away from Europe. Finally, the authors point to both the ways in which this process was occasioned by significant violence and the way in which that violence became more widespread and more effective. In comparison to the 19th century, when wars between the European states themselves tended to be minor and brief in nature, and when conflict between European powers and non-European states were equally brief and lopsided affairs, the 20th century was characterized by unparalleled violence and human suffering. Amongst the notable wars that involved the European powers were World War I and World War II, and the combined casualties of both those wars approached somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million. Even wars amongst non-European powers were significant. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, for instance, claimed more than 1 million lives and ranks as one of the longest military conflicts of the 20th century. But as Best and his colleagues point out, it was not simply that war was engaged in more often. It was that, A, when war came, it was made more destructive and enduring by the very industrial and technological capacity that was otherwise enriching the globe, which is to say that the first point is that technology made war more destructive, technology that could also produce good things like cars and lighting and many other luxuries. So technology made war more destructive, but also, and they make this point as a kind of fourth motive force or characteristic of the 20th century, wars were made bigger and more worth fighting by dint of the fact that the modern state was better able to mobilize ordinary people to fight and die in wars and keep them enthusiastically engaged in them longer. If this was so, it was because of the impact of modern political ideologies, which is to say, ideas about the proper ordering of society, be it for national freedom or for the rule of the Aryan race over the non-Aryans. These ideologies made the costs and stakes of war more worth enduring and achieving despite the destructive impact of war. And people were mobilized by them, as we see in this picture of Hitler at a rally where thousands of people gather around the National Socialist ideal and embrace it. Amongst those ideologies that made war more enduring and rallied people to the cause of war, and were things like fascism and Nazism. And fascism, Nazism protested the British and French domination of a kind of global system. But there was other ideologies that stemmed from frustrations with the project of modernization, ideologies like socialism and communism. What they sought to do was to even the balance of society, and they mobilized millions in that cause. And sometimes socialism and communism were linked with nationalism. And in places like China, this was a potent combination, for instance, that linked the notion of freeing people from poverty, but also freeing people from the domination of the Europeans.